The harsh Alaskan wind was a physical thing, a phantom hand that shoved and clawed at the thin frame of the old man. It whipped through the dense spruce and hemlock, carrying the scent of damp earth, distant ice, and an immense, predatory solitude. The sound of the engine, a brutish growl of internal combustion, was fading, a dying promise of warmth and civilization swallowed by the wilderness. The old man, Elias Vance, stood motionless, his posture unwavering as the red taillights of the modified Jeep Wrangler vanished around a bend in the makeshift trail. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a pressure against the eardrums. It was a silence that knew things, a silence that had watched mountains rise and fall, a silence that had no patience for the fragile pulse of a human heart. His son's last words hung in the frigid air, sharp and cruel as shards of ice. "Bye. Go meet a grizzly bear." The words weren't just a farewell. They were a sentence, a judgment delivered with the casual arrogance of youth. To his son, Kevin, this was the end of a problem. An inconvenient, slow-moving, silent father, a relic of a bygone era, now disposed of in the vast, unforgiving cathedral of the Alaskan backcountry. Elias pulled the collar of his worn, canvas jacket tighter around his neck. His face, a roadmap of 70 years etched with lines of quiet endurance, showed no fear, no anger, no panic. There was only a profound stillness, a deep and abiding calm that seemed to emanate from him, pushing back against the encroaching chill. He tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in a state of listening, of attunement. The forest wasn't a threat. It was a language, and he was, perhaps, its most fluent living speaker. The world saw a frail elder, stooped and slow, with a subtle, almost imperceptible limp in his right leg. They saw calloused hands and a gaze that seemed to look through things rather than at them. What they didn't see, what his own son could not comprehend, was the truth forged in the crucible of the world's harshest environments. They didn't know that abandoning Elias Vance in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness wasn't a death sentence. It was a homecoming. Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the stories that remind us of the quiet strength and hidden honor that often lie dormant, waiting for a moment to reveal themselves. Today, we delve into a tale of profound disrespect and an even more profound revelation. A story that asks us to look deeper, past the surface of age and humility, to see the giant that may be sleeping within. If you believe that true strength is quiet and that honor is earned, not given, make sure you subscribe and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss the moment the world discovers who this old man really is. This wasn't just any forest. This was the Chugach, a sprawling, untamed wilderness where nature was not a gentle mother but a stern and unforgiving sovereign. For Kevin, it was an Instagram backdrop. For Elias, it was the old proving grounds. As he stood there, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of information. The way the wind moved through the Sitka spruce told him about the coming pressure change. The distant, sharp crack of a branch under a heavy foot, too rhythmic for a moose, told him a bear was active, but miles to the west and moving away. He didn't need a map. His memory was the map, etched into his mind over decades of traversing this very terrain, in conditions that would break lesser men. He turned his face from the direction the jeep had gone and looked deeper into the woods, into the gathering gloom of the afternoon. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. It was not a smile of mirth, but of recognition. The surprise wasn't for him. The surprise was for his son. The journey home had just begun, and he would not be late. He would move through this world not as a trespasser, but as a ghost, a legend returning to the land that had forged him, ready to teach one final, unforgettable lesson in respect. The silence held its breath, waiting. The legend was on the move again. Elias Vance's life was a study in quiet minimalism, a deliberate retreat from a world that had grown too loud, too fast, too obsessed with the ephemeral. His small cabin, nestled at the edge of the sprawling forest reserve, was more a part of the landscape than an imposition upon it. Built by his own hands decades ago, the logs had silvered with age, settling into the earth as if they had grown there. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and drying herbs. There was no television. The only music was the wind in the pines and the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth. His days followed a simple, predictable rhythm. He would rise before the sun, his movements slow but deliberate, a concession to the old injuries that ached in the damp morning air. A web of faint, silvery scars crisscrossed his forearms, stories written in flesh that he never told. The most prominent was a puckered mark on his right thigh, the source of his slight limp, a memento from a place and time he had locked away in the deepest vault of his memory. He would spend his mornings tending to his small garden or carving intricate figures of animals from blocks of basswood. Wolves, eagles, bears, each one imbued with a lifelike intensity, their wooden eyes seeming to hold a deep, ancient wisdom. These weren't just carvings. They were acts of meditation, a way of communing with the wild spirits of the land he so deeply respected. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were sparse and carefully chosen, like stones worn smooth by a river. He never spoke of his past. To the few people in the nearest town, a 30-mile drive away, he was simply Old Man Vance, a quiet recluse, a harmless eccentric who kept to himself. They saw the humble cabin, the patched-up clothes, the way he seemed to prefer the company of the forest to that of people, and they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. A logger, perhaps, a trapper who had outlived his time. No one ever guessed the truth. No one saw the ghost of a legend in the stooped shoulders of the man buying flour and salt at the general store. His past was not entirely erased, however. There were clues, for those who knew where to look. Tucked away in a small, locked footlocker under his bed was a single, impeccably folded flag, its colors still vibrant. Beside it lay a set of dress blues, the uniform of a United States Army Sergeant Major, adorned with a constellation of medals that would make a general stand at attention. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, multiple bronze stars and purple hearts, and a small, unassuming badge that, to the initiated, was more significant than all the others. The arched tab of the Army Rangers, and below it, the subdued patch of a master instructor at the Northern Warfare Training Center. This was his secret history, the life he had lived before he chose silence. He was not just a soldier. He was a teacher of soldiers, a master of survival in the world's most brutal and unforgiving climates. He had spent 30 years in the service, most of it in the frozen, unforgiving landscapes of Alaska and the high peaks of the Hindu Kush. He was the man the Special Forces called when they needed to learn how to live, fight, and win in places where the cold itself was the primary enemy. Men who were considered legends in their own right spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. They called him the ghost of the glacier, a man who could move through a blizzard without a sound, who could read a landscape like a book, who understood the cold not as an obstacle, but as an ally. He had retired 20 years ago, trading the uniform for a life of quiet solitude, content to let that world fade into memory. He asked for nothing. He expected no recognition. The skills he had honed, the knowledge he possessed, now lay dormant, used only for his own quiet existence. But dormancy is not death. The embers of the old fire still glowed, buried deep beneath the ashes of time, waiting for a spark, for a reason to burn brightly once more. His son, in his ignorance and cruelty, had just provided that spark. Kevin Vance existed in a different universe from his father, a universe of polished surfaces, digital connections, and instant gratification. He was a product of the modern world, a successful software developer from Seattle whose life was measured in stock options, app downloads, and the envy of his peers on social media. He saw his father's life not as one of chosen simplicity, but of abject failure. The small cabin was a hovel. The silence was a sign of senility. The quiet dignity was weakness. To Kevin, Elias was a burden, a frustrating anachronism he had to deal with out of a begrudging sense of familial duty. This trip to Alaska, he had told his girlfriend Sarah, was his final attempt to connect. But in truth, it was an obligation he was desperate to conclude. He drove the gleaming, ruby-red Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that cost more than his father's cabin and everything in it, with an impatient, aggressive skill. It was a machine built for the wild, but he treated it like a city sports car, revving the engine unnecessarily, annoyed by every rock and rut in the trail. Beside him, Sarah sat quietly, her unease a tangible presence in the car. She was the observer, the audience surrogate, caught between Kevin's casual cruelty and the enigmatic silence of his father in the back seat. Sarah had been drawn to Kevin's confidence and ambition, but lately, she had begun to see the arrogance that lay beneath it. On this trip, it was on full display. She watched the way Kevin spoke to Elias, his voice laced with a condescending, patronizing tone. "Dad, put your seatbelt on. I know you're not used to it, but it's the law. No, Dad, you can't just drink from a stream. You'll get sick. We have bottled water." Each comment was a small cut, a dismissal of a lifetime of experience she was beginning to suspect ran deeper than anyone knew. Sarah found herself watching Elias instead. She noticed things Kevin missed. She saw the way the old man's eyes constantly scanned the terrain, not with a vacant stare, but with an active, intelligent assessment. She saw the subtle way he pointed out a patch of loose gravel on the trail, a gesture Kevin ignored just before the Jeep fishtailed slightly. She saw the quiet competence in his hands as he instinctively checked the tension on the winch cable when they stopped for a break. There was a moment early in the trip that had cemented her growing suspicion. Elias had been wearing an old, faded field jacket. As he reached for a thermos, the sleeve had ridden up, revealing a tattoo on his weathered forearm. It was faded, the ink blurred by time and sun, but the image was still clear. A snarling wolf's head superimposed over a mountain peak, encircled by a motto in Latin. She couldn't read the words, but the image was powerful, primal. It was a symbol of a warrior, not a woodsman. When Kevin saw her looking, he scoffed. "Oh, that old thing. He probably got it in a bar fight 50 years ago. Don't worry, he's harmless." But Sarah didn't think it was harmless. She thought it was a key, a piece of a puzzle that Kevin was too blind or too arrogant to even see. She represented the audience's growing awareness, the dawning realization that the drama playing out was built on a foundation of profound ignorance. The tension in the Jeep was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kevin's frustration mounted with every passing mile. His father's silence grated on him, a passive-aggressive judgment he couldn't stand. He had concocted this plan, the camping trip, as a means to an end. He had convinced himself it was for his father's own good, a way to force a conversation about moving him into an assisted living facility. But the silence had defeated him. It had driven him to a place of cold, calculated cruelty. And so the plan had changed. He wasn't just going to have a conversation. He was going to prove his point. He was going to show his father, once and for all, that he was helpless, that he needed Kevin, that the world he once knew was gone and he couldn't survive in it anymore. The dramatic irony was staggering. He was about to leave a master of the wild in the heart of his own kingdom to prove he couldn't survive there. Sarah could feel the precipice approaching. She didn't know the specifics of Kevin's plan, but she could sense the storm gathering behind his eyes, a cold and selfish anger that was about to break. She looked in the rearview mirror, at the old man's calm, weathered face, and a shiver went down her spine. She wasn't worried for him. She was worried for Kevin. The inciting incident was not a single, explosive moment, but a slow, deliberate act of cruelty, meticulously planned and executed with a chilling lack of empathy. As they ventured deeper into the Chugach National Forest, the narrow dirt track becoming more of a suggestion than a road, Kevin pulled the Jeep to an abrupt halt. He let the engine idle for a moment, the sound an angry intrusion in the vast, green silence. "Well, that's it," he announced with a sigh that was pure theater. "Sounds like the transmission is shot." He turned to his father in the back seat, his expression a carefully crafted mask of concern. "Dad, I'm gonna need you to get out. I need to lighten the load to see if I can limp it back to a place with cell service." Elias said nothing. His eyes, clear and steady, met Kevin's in the rearview mirror. There was no flicker of fear, no hint of protest. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out into the wilderness, his old boots making a soft crunch on the gravelly soil. He stood by the side of the track, his hands resting gently at his sides, a solitary figure against the immense backdrop of ancient trees and distant, snow-dusted peaks. Sarah watched, her heart pounding. "Kevin, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's nothing wrong with the Jeep." Kevin didn't look at her. He put the vehicle in reverse, his knuckles white on the gearshift. "I'm teaching him a lesson," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "He needs a reality check. A few hours out here, he'll be begging for that retirement home. He needs to understand he can't take care of himself anymore." This was the public challenge, the moment of ultimate humiliation. It wasn't just an act of abandonment. It was a profound statement of dismissal. It was a son declaring his father obsolete, erasing his entire history of strength and competence with a single arrogant act. Elias stood and watched as the Jeep reversed, turned, and began to pull away. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply observed, his expression unreadable. As the Jeep began to pick up speed, Kevin rolled down his window. He couldn't resist a final, taunting jab, the line that would echo in the silence long after he was gone. "I'll be back for you in a day or two. Try not to get eaten. Bye. Go meet a grizzly bear." And then he was gone. The sound of the engine receded, absorbed by the million waiting leaves of the forest, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. The rising action had begun. Elias was alone, cast out by his own blood. But as he stood there, taking his first deep breath of the crisp, untainted air, it was clear that the roles had been reversed. It was not the father who was lost. It was the son. Elias began his assessment. His movements were economical, wasting no energy. He scanned the canopy, noting the direction of the wind and the position of the sun. He crumbled a bit of soil between his fingers, testing its moisture content. He listened, not with his ears, but with his whole body, feeling the vibrations of the forest floor, sensing the subtle rhythms of the ecosystem he had been dropped into. This was not a survival situation for him. This was a diagnostic test, a return to first principles. While Kevin drove away, his chest puffed with the smug satisfaction of a battle won. The true conflict was just beginning. In his mind, he had solidified his role as the caretaker, the responsible adult dealing with a difficult elder. In reality, he had solidified his role as the ignorant foil, the fool in a drama whose true scope he could not possibly imagine. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, rigid with a mixture of shame and fury. She was the observer, the witness to this profound injustice, and her silence was a form of complicity she already regretted. She risked a glance back, but the old man was already gone, not vanished, but simply no longer there, as if he had been absorbed into the landscape itself, a ghost returning to his rightful haunt. The open loop, the question of who this man truly was, had been pulled taut. The tension was no longer a quiet hum. It was a screaming, vibrant thing. The forest knew the answer, and soon so would everyone else. The lesson had begun. The wilderness that Kevin saw as a green prison was, to Elias Vance, a place of profound clarity and abundant resource. He moved away from the track where he had been abandoned, stepping from the world of men back into the world of nature with the ease of a man crossing his own threshold. His limp seemed to vanish on the uneven forest floor, his body remembering a more ancient and efficient way of moving. He flowed over fallen logs and through dense thickets, not with speed, but with a preternatural grace, his footsteps making almost no sound. He was not fighting the environment. He was harmonizing with it. His first priority was water. He ignored the gushing, obvious creek at the bottom of the ravine, its water cold and fast. A novice would drink from it. Elias knew better. He followed a barely perceptible game trail upwards, his eyes scanning the moss on the north side of the trees, his senses attuned to the subtle shift in humidity. He found what he was looking for halfway up the ridge. A small, almost invisible spring seeping directly from the granite rock face, filtered by 100 feet of stone and earth. The water was pure, clean, and cold. He drank deeply, then refilled the simple metal canteen he always carried in his jacket pocket. a habit from a lifetime ago that had never left him. Next, shelter. He didn't need to build one. He knew this terrain intimately. He crested the ridge and descended into a small, sheltered bowl on the other side, a natural amphitheater protected from the wind by a sheer rock wall. At the base of the wall was a shallow overhang, not quite a cave, but more than enough to provide cover. The floor was dry, carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles accumulated over decades. It was a place he had used for training exercises 30 years prior. It was like returning to a familiar room in a forgotten house. As dusk began to bleed its purple and orange hues across the sky, he prepared for the night. He didn't build a large, roaring fire, the beacon of a lost and frightened man. Instead, he gathered a specific type of dry, dead-standing birch and a handful of resinous pine knots. In a small depression shielded by rocks, he constructed a Dakota fire hole, a technique that produced a hot, efficient, and virtually smokeless flame, its light almost invisible from more than a few yards away. He lit it with a small ferro rod from his pocket, a shower of sparks catching the tinder, and soon a small, controlled fire glowed in the pit, a hidden heart of warmth in the vast cold. He had no food, but he felt no hunger. His body was a finely tuned machine, accustomed to scarcity. He sat with his back against the rock wall, the latent heat of the sun-baked stone seeping into his old bones. He was not merely surviving, he was presiding. The forest came alive around him. The hoot of a great horned owl, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the rustle of a snowshoe hare in the undergrowth. To an outsider, these were sounds of menace. To Elias, they were the familiar voices of neighbors. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen more deeply, to feel the pulse of the living world around him. He was a part of it again, a silent, watchful predator, a ghost in his own machine. Back in the Jeep, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken recriminations. Kevin drove with a tense, aggressive focus, the smugness he felt earlier already beginning to curdle into a defensive anger. He kept glancing at Sarah, expecting her to say something, to challenge him, but her silence was more damning than any accusation. She stared out the window, her face a pale, strained mask. She was the surrogate for the audience's horror, her internal monologue a cascade of shock and disbelief. How could he do this? To his own father? Kevin finally broke the silence, his voice tight. He'll be fine. It'll be good for him. A little dose of reality. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes cold. Reality? Kevin, you left your 70-year-old father in the middle of nowhere. What's wrong with you? Nothing is wrong with me, he snapped. I'm trying to help him. He's stubborn, he doesn't listen. He thinks he's still young and capable, but he's not. He's just an old man with a limp. This is the only way to make him see. The dramatic irony was a chasm between them. Every word Kevin spoke to diminish his father only served to magnify his own ignorance in the eyes of the audience, and in the dawning awareness of Sarah. She shook her head slowly, turning back to the window. You're wrong, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You are so wrong. The observer had passed her judgment. The stage was now set for the vindicator. The narrative was building its inexorable rhythm, the crescendo approaching. While Kevin barreled down a dirt road toward a confrontation with his own colossal ignorance, Elias sat by his hidden fire, a figure of absolute peace and competence, waiting. The wilderness knew who he was. The audience knew who he was. And soon, with the force of an avalanche, so would his son. The drive back to his father's cabin took Kevin and Sarah several hours. The strained silence in the Jeep was a heavy blanket, suffocating and fraught with unspoken anger. Kevin's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive posture. He rehearsed his justifications in his head, polishing the arguments he would use when he inevitably had to explain his actions. He would frame it as tough love, a necessary intervention. He was the hero of his own story, the responsible son forced to make a hard choice. Sarah, meanwhile, was lost in a sea of disillusionment. The man she thought she knew, confident, successful, charismatic, had revealed a core of profound cruelty and arrogance. She kept replaying the image of Elias standing by the side of the road, his quiet, unshakable dignity a stark contrast to his son's petulant rage. She remembered the tattoo, the wolf, and the mountain. It wasn't the mark of a victim. It was the mark of something else entirely. As they finally pulled onto the gravel track leading to the cabin, the late afternoon sun was casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. Kevin killed the engine, and the sudden silence was jarring. "Right," he said, trying to inject a note of normalcy into his voice. "Let's get our stuff inside. I'll call the park rangers in the morning and file a missing person report. We'll play it like he wandered off while I was looking for a campsite." He was already constructing the lie, blind to the moral wreckage around him. Sarah just shook her head, not bothering to reply. She got out of the Jeep and looked at the small, rustic cabin. It looked different now. Less like a shack, more like a fortress of solitude. The home of a man who had chosen his life, not had it forced upon him. Kevin grabbed their bags from the back, grumbling about the lack of a proper driveway. He stomped up the 3 wooden steps to the porch and reached for the doorknob. And then he froze. The door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of warm, yellow light spilled out into the twilight, cutting a sharp line across the dusty porch boards. A tendril of wood smoke, smelling of birch and pine, curled lazily from the stone chimney. Kevin's mind raced, struggling to process the information. A squatter? A burglar? He pushed the door open, his bravado returning in a rush of adrenaline. "Hey, who's in here?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet clearing. And then he saw him. The shock was a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. Elias Vance was sitting in his high-backed wooden chair by the hearth. A small, well-behaved fire crackled on the grate, casting a warm, flickering glow on his weathered face. He was holding a half-finished wooden carving of a wolf, a small whittling knife in his other hand. He looked up as Kevin and Sarah entered, his expression calm, peaceful, as if he were merely expecting them for dinner. He wasn't disheveled. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't even dirty. He looked as if he had spent the entire day right there, in that chair. The impossible reality of the scene short-circuited Kevin's brain. It was a 5-hour drive from where he had left his father. Even if he had started walking immediately, even if he were a young man in peak physical condition, it would have been impossible for him to get back here first. There were no roads, no trails, just miles of unforgiving, dense forest and mountainous terrain. "How?" Kevin stammered, pointing a trembling finger. "How did you? What are you doing here?" Elias placed his carving and his knife carefully on the small table beside him. He looked at his son, his eyes holding no anger, no triumph, only a deep, quiet gravity. He had not walked back. He had flowed. Using knowledge of the land that predated any map, he had moved through ravines and over ridges in a direct line, a path invisible to anyone but him, a path he could traverse with the speed and efficiency of a hunting wolf. He had been waiting for them for over an hour. He rose slowly from his chair, the old joints protesting with a faint creak. He walked past his stunned son and the awestruck Sarah, and looked out the open door into the gathering darkness. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of an impending storm. "I have a surprise for you." It was the ultimate understatement. The quiet hero had returned from his ordeal, not broken, but stronger, his mastery of his world reaffirmed. The twist was complete. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shattered. Kevin was no longer the one in control, no longer the dispenser of lessons. He was about to become the student in a masterclass he would never forget. The real lesson was about to begin. Just as Elias spoke those quiet, loaded words, the night was split apart by the glare of high-intensity headlights. A vehicle, large and dark, was turning off the main road onto the cabin's long, unpaved driveway. It moved with a purpose and confidence that was utterly alien to this secluded corner of the world. Kevin, still reeling from the impossible sight of his father, spun around, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. "Who is that? Are you expecting someone?" Elias didn't answer. He simply stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light of the cabin, and watched the vehicle approach. It wasn't a truck or a family car. It was a black, government-issue Chevrolet Suburban, the kind that whispers of serious business, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness. The tires crunched on the gravel with a sound like grinding teeth, and it came to a halt a respectful distance from the porch. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled with a low, powerful rumble. The headlights remained on, pinning the cabin in their sterile, white glare. The tension was electric, a palpable force in the air. Then the doors opened. They opened in unison, a display of practiced, disciplined coordination. 4 men emerged. They were not locals. They were dressed in functional, tactical civilian clothing, durable pants, dark jackets, sturdy boots. But it was the way they moved that set them apart. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. They moved with the quiet, coiled spring efficiency of predators, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing, aware of everything. They were soldiers, that much was clear. Elite soldiers. The camera would pan slowly, a classic Jezen visual cue. A slow-motion shot of their boots hitting the gravel, the dust rising around them. A close-up on the hard, disciplined set of their jaws. Their presence instantly transformed the scene. The small, rustic clearing around the cabin became a stage, a focal point of immense gravity. A 5th man emerged from the passenger side. He was older than the others, with short-cropped, graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a simple black jacket, but under it, the crisp collar of a military uniform was visible, and on it, the silver eagle of a full colonel. He moved to the front of the vehicle and stood for a moment, his gaze fixed on the figure in the doorway. He was the vindicator. His arrival signaled the climax, the moment of truth. Kevin was completely wrong-footed. He stared at the men, his mouth agape. "Dad, who are these people? Are you in some kind of trouble?" he asked, his voice a mixture of fear and accusation. This had to be his father's fault. Everything was always his father's fault. The colonel took a step forward, and the other 4 men fanned out slightly, not in a threatening way, but in a formation of protective reverence. They were a Praetorian guard, and Elias was their emperor. The colonel stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked past Kevin, his eyes locked on Elias. His entire demeanor, which had been one of command and authority, softened into something else entirely. A look of profound, almost reverent respect. He brought his heels together with a soft click and gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture far more meaningful than any salute. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been pulverized. Kevin, the arrogant software developer, the master of his digital universe, was suddenly a small, insignificant child in the presence of something ancient and powerful he couldn't comprehend. Sarah, the observer, stood by the wall, her hand over her mouth. Her suspicion had been a flickering candle. This was a raging bonfire. She was witnessing the unveiling of a secret history, the moment a quiet man's hidden life stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The colonel finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute attention. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. But he was not speaking to Kevin. He wasn't even acknowledging his existence. His words were directed only at the old man in the doorway. "Sergeant Major Vance," he said, and the name, the rank, hung in the air, heavy with history and meaning. "We were in the area for a training exercise. We heard you were back. We had to come and pay our respects." The reveal had begun. The witness had taken the stage, and the world was about to be remade. The colonel, whose nameplate on his uniform would later be seen to read Jackson, took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the old man on the porch. The dramatic monologue, the heart of the Jezen formula, was about to be delivered. The air crackled with anticipation. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. "My son thinks you're just a helpless old man," Elias said, his voice flat, emotionless. It was not an accusation but a simple statement of fact, a piece of data offered for consideration. It was the perfect, minimalist setup for the witness to completely demolish. Colonel Jackson's jaw tightened. A flicker of something, disbelief, anger, perhaps even pity for the son's monumental ignorance, crossed his face before he smoothed it back into a mask of military discipline. He finally turned his gaze to Kevin, and the full weight of his command presence descended upon the younger man. It was like being pinned by a searchlight. "Your son," Colonel Jackson began, his voice dangerously quiet, "sees a cabin. I see the place the toughest men I have ever known called the University of Pain. He sees a quiet old man. I see the man who wrote the book on how to survive in hell, and then taught the rest of us how to read it. He sees a limp. I see a man who walked 10 miles through a blizzard with a shattered femur and 2 wounded soldiers on his back to save his entire platoon. You see weakness, son. We see a legend." The words landed like hammer blows. Each sentence dismantled a piece of Kevin's reality. The 4 soldiers standing behind Jackson remained perfectly still, their expressions unreadable, but their very presence was a testament to the truth of their commander's words. Jackson took a breath and continued, his voice rising slightly in passion and reverence. This was the monologue that would be underscored by dramatic music, interspersed with on-screen text listing medals and commendations. "We don't call him Elias Vance. We call him the Ghost. For 30 years, this man, your father, was the lead instructor for the Army's Northern Warfare Training Center. Every Green Beret, every Navy SEAL, every Delta operator, every Ranger who has ever deployed to a cold-weather environment in the last 3 decades learned how to stay alive from him. He taught them how to build a shelter with a knife and a shoelace in a whiteout. He taught them how to find food where there is none. He taught them how to navigate by the stars when all their electronics were frozen solid. He didn't just teach survival. He is survival." He pointed a finger, not at Elias, but at the vast, dark forest that surrounded them. "You think you left him in a prison. You left him in his own backyard. You worried about a grizzly bear meeting him? Son, the grizzly bears in this forest tell stories about him to their cubs. The reason he beat your high-tech, 4-wheel drive Jeep back to this cabin is because he didn't need your roads. He knows this land like the back of his hand because he is this land. While you were driving on a path, he was moving in a straight line, through terrain that would kill an ordinary man in an hour. Reaction shots would cut quickly. Sarah, her eyes wide with awe and tears welling up, finally understanding the quiet strength she had sensed. Kevin, his face pale, his jaw slack, his entire worldview crumbling into dust. His arrogance, his condescension, his pity for his father, all of it was being revealed as the pathetic posturing of a fool. Jackson wasn't finished. He stepped onto the porch, his voice dropping to a more personal, reverent tone as he addressed Elias directly. "We were running a search and rescue simulation today, Sergeant Major. A high-altitude, low-opening jump into the Tordrillo Mountains. My best team. We lost one of our guys. They searched for 6 hours and found nothing. We gave them the scenario parameters you wrote back in '98. The Vance Protocol. The kid on my team who finally found him? He said he just asked himself one question. What would the ghost do? That's your legacy, sir. It's not in medals or parades. It's in the men who came home because of you." The camera would zoom in on Elias's face. For the first time, a flicker of emotion. Not pride, not triumph, but a deep, resonant sadness. The quiet burden of a man who had seen too much. The vindication was complete. The hero's true identity had been revealed in the most dramatic and authoritative way possible. The power dynamic had not just been shifted. It had been inverted, shattered, and remade. Kevin was no longer the son dealing with a frail father. He was a clueless boy standing in the shadow of a giant. The silence that followed the colonel's monologue was deafening, broken only by the gentle crackle of the fire from inside the cabin. The aftermath of the reveal was a tableau of stunned silence. The weight of Colonel Jackson's words hung in the cold night air, seeming to press down on Kevin, bending his proud posture until he looked small and broken. His face, usually a mask of confident arrogance, was a canvas of raw, conflicting emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a dawning, crushing wave of shame. He looked from the imposing figure of the colonel to the quiet, stooped form of his father, and for the first time in his life, he was seeing him clearly. He wasn't seeing a feeble old man. He was seeing a monument, a man forged from elements so foreign to his own experience that he might as well have been from another planet. All the years of his condescension, his impatience, his casual cruelty, flashed through his mind, each memory now recast in the horrifying light of the truth. He had mocked a hero. He had pitted a legend. He had tried to teach a lesson in survival to the master of the art. The foolishness of it all was so immense, so profound, it left no room for words. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? Sorry was a word too small, too hollow to contain the magnitude of his transgression. He was shamed into a silence more complete than any his father had ever practiced. Sarah, the observer, stepped forward slightly. The awe on her face was clear. She looked at Elias, and her expression was one of absolute reverence. She had been the first to sense that there was more to him, the first to see past the surface, and this revelation was a vindication of her own intuition. She walked over to where Elias stood and gently touched his arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her apology encompassing not just her own complicity but her sorrow for the disrespect he had endured from his son. Elias turned his head and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. His honor was restored, his quiet dignity reaffirmed not by his own words, but by the powerful testimony of those who knew his true worth. The resolution phase began, marked by the hero's characteristic humility. Elias showed no signs of triumph. He did not gloat or lecture his son. The lesson had been delivered, and he had no need to rub salt in the wound. He turned to Colonel Jackson. "It's a long drive back to the base, Colonel. You and your men want some coffee before you go." It was a simple, humble offer, a gesture that immediately deflated the high drama of the moment and brought it back down to a human level. It was his way of saying, "The ceremony is over. We are just men again." Colonel Jackson smiled, a rare, genuine expression of warmth. "We'd be honored, Sergeant Major." As the soldiers, men who were themselves elite warriors, filed respectfully into the small, rustic cabin, their formidable presence seeming to fill the small space, Kevin remained frozen on the porch. He watched as one of the younger soldiers, a man who looked like he could run through a brick wall, took a mug of coffee from his father's hand with a quiet "Thank you, sir." His voice filled with a level of respect Kevin had never once shown. The falling action was complete. The antagonists had been silenced, the hero's honor was restored, and the world had been set right. Elias Vance was vindicated, but he remained unchanged. He was still the quiet, humble man he had chosen to be. He had not needed this moment, but his son had. The narrative now shifted to its final, moralistic conclusion, the quiet reflection after the storm. Kevin slowly sank down onto the porch steps, burying his face in his hands. The surprise his father had promised was not the arrival of the soldiers. The surprise was the truth. The surprise was the sudden, brutal, and necessary destruction of his own arrogance. He had left his father in the woods to meet a grizzly bear, and in a way he had. He had come face to face with a power, a history, and a form of manhood he never knew existed, and it had mauled his pride, leaving him stripped bare and utterly humbled. The final resolution was not loud, but a quiet, internal transformation. As Colonel Jackson and his men prepared to leave, after sharing a brief and respectful coffee in the cabin, the colonel paused on the porch beside the still-seated Kevin. He didn't speak to him with anger, but with the quiet authority of a teacher. "Your father has a box of his old things under his bed," he said, his voice low. "Maybe it's time you looked inside. See the man you never knew." With a final nod to Elias, who stood in the doorway, Jackson and his team departed, their black Suburban disappearing into the night as quietly and efficiently as it had arrived, leaving the clearing once again to the silence of the forest. The silence now felt different. It was no longer empty or menacing. It was filled with the weight of unspoken history, of quiet valor. The narrator's voice would swell, bringing the story to its thematic conclusion. We live in a world that worships the loud, the boastful, the self-promoter. We are taught to judge by appearances, by bank accounts, by social media profiles. We mistake silence for weakness and humility for failure. But the greatest strength, the most profound honor, often resides in the quietest corners, in the unassuming souls who have lived lives we can barely imagine. They ask for no applause, they seek no recognition. They are the quiet heroes who walk among us, their greatness hidden in plain sight, their medals tucked away in dusty boxes, their stories written not in headlines, but in the lives they saved and the people they inspired. Elias Vance was one such man. He had faced down the worst of man and nature, and his reward was a life of peace and solitude. He had not sought this confrontation with his son, but he had not shied away from it. He had allowed his son's ignorance to lead him to a moment of profound truth, the most important lesson a father can ever teach, the lesson of respect. Later that night, long after Elias had gone to bed, Kevin finally entered the cabin. He moved quietly, like a trespasser in his own father's home. He found the old wooden footlocker under the bed, just as the colonel had said. His hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, bathed in the soft moonlight filtering through the window, lay the relics of a life he had never known. The perfectly folded flag, the immaculate dress uniform, the rows of medals, each one a testament to a moment of incredible bravery. He picked up the Distinguished Service Cross, its weight feeling immense in his hand. He read the citation, the dry, official language describing an act of heroism so profound it seemed impossible. He saw photos of a young, impossibly vital Elias, surrounded by other young men, all of them hard-eyed and proud, standing in frozen landscapes that looked like another world. For the first time, Kevin truly saw his father. He saw the warrior, the leader, the teacher. He saw the giant whose shadow he had been living in without ever realizing it. And in that moment, something inside him broke, and something new began to grow in its place. He closed the box, his movements now gentle, reverent. The lesson was complete. His father's surprise had been delivered. It was the gift of perspective, the gift of humility, the gift of truth. He had been given a second chance to know the remarkable man who was his father. And now the rest was up to him. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their humble appearance? Have you ever dismissed the quiet wisdom of your elders? Share your stories in the comments below. Let's talk about the unsung heroes in our own lives, the giants who walk quietly among us. If this story of quiet honor and profound vindication resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Remember to click the bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration. For in every quiet soul, there may be a story of courage waiting to be told. All we have to do is be willing to listen.